Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics, brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the writer of the already released in digital, but soon to be released in print, Graveneye over at TKO. It's Sloane Leong. Thanks for coming on, Sloane.
Hey, thank you for having me.
So how's it going in Portland today?
It is pretty dreary, but I'm pushing through it.
So you said before we started recording that you moved there about 10 years ago. Did you move mostly because like the comic community there, or was it something else?
It was a combination. One of the big things was, I grew up in Hawaii, and at the time, it was like early 2000s. And the price of living in Hawaii is just insane. Like a gallon of milk is like $8, just like you're trying to subsist on even the most basic things was just like impossible. So me and my parents and my younger brother and sister, we moved to Southern Oregon because a friend of us told us it was like really cool and it was like different from other places we had lived. We've never lived anywhere with seasons. So we moved there. And also brought up my grandparents so we could start kind of taking care of them. So a lot of it was like family oriented and just like, financial.
Yeah.
But yeah, as I grew up, I was like, okay, I want to check out Portland. And then I realized there was like a big comic scene there. So when I was like 17, I went to my first like little comics festival, which was Stumptown.
Mm-hmm.
And that was just like mind blowing for me to see like indie cartoonists like doing mini comics and making their own stuff. I had grown up mostly on manga because that was like the only thing kind of available at the one bookstore on the island I grew up on. So it was just really awesome to see something that was like, it was like American and it was just very relatable, and all the styles were like so different and came from different like visual traditions. And yeah, I was just super wowed. So I was like, okay, I have to like embed myself into the scene. This is so cool.
That's awesome. Yeah. I mean, that's one really cool thing about Portland. I mean, I go down there from time to time because when I graduated from college, half my friends moved back to Alaska and the other half moved to Portland. And so I'd go down and visit friends, and there always seemed like there was like a zine fest, or like what was the thing that they used to have? Line work. And they would have
line work.
Yeah, they'd have all these different events that kind of represented all different aspects of comics. And I don't know. I mean, I know there's pluses and minuses to everywhere, but at the same time, it does seem like it's a pretty good place to be for you to discover different sides of this crazy world we're in.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, you had like all these indie festivals, and then you have the more mainstream like
Rose City.
Yeah, there used to be like Wizard World, and then in like Seattle you have like Emerald City, which is, it's not that far to get there. So I count that as like our part of our circuit.
Yeah.
But yeah.
It is absolutely incredible, but you were the second person. Actually, I guess I was the other person, but this is the second time in I think 3 podcasts that the price of milk was brought up in the podcast. This is honestly astonishing. This is my favorite trend in a while, but as much as I would love to talk about the price of milk, I actually want to start way at the beginning for you, because when I was doing my research for this, I came across a story you told that is like honestly one of my favorite early comic stories I've ever read. I read that in 3rd grade that you turn your weekly vocabulary lists into like short comic stories using all of the words, and that you do that every week. Yes. Were those basically like your first comics? Was that something that just made sense in your brain?
Yeah, pretty much. I hadn't even started reading comics then. I didn't come to comics until like, I think I was like 12 or 13, a little bit mid-teens. And most of my inspiration for drawing came from like cartoons, animated movies, and just like reading tons of books. So yeah, to combine my love for like reading and writing and drawing, I was like, I could just like illustrate my vocabulary list every week. And I did that.
That is awesome.
It's a lot of stories. My teacher is like, oh, great. Thanks.
I was going to say, like, I feel like my teachers, or a lot of teachers would probably be super impressed by that, because the inventiveness it takes to do that is pretty, I don't know. I would have been really impressed. I would have given you an A every week.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think she was just like, oh, thank you for these 30 pages that I now have to read and make sure that you included all the vocabulary words.
Well, I guess that's one of the things I think is really interesting. I mean, maybe it's because the cartoons, maybe it's because of just kind of influences from things that you can't really put your finger on. But it seems like because you didn't discover comics until, decent amount of time after that, it just kind of seems like the combination of words and art always seemed to make sense to you. Was that something that, you always found appealing when you were younger and like you just kind of toyed around with that type of stuff, even without the influence of comics?
Yeah, totally. I've always just been a very, someone, basically just a kid who was always like not stuck in their own head, but like I enjoyed just like living in my own world. When I was younger, I moved around, my parents moved around a lot. So I was in a different school for almost every grade. And so I didn't have a lot of friends, and it's hard kind of breaking out of like the new kid mold if you're not there longer than a year. So I was basically like, okay, I'm just gonna like entertain myself, and so I would do that by reading or drawing, and so yeah, it just seemed natural to like illustrate my stories.
Mm-hmm. So you said you started engaging with comics when you were like 12 or 13. And was that manga basically from the start?
Yeah, pretty much. I would hang out at like our local Barnes and Noble while my mom worked, and they did have some like a small collection of like, superhero comics, and those are interesting, but I was just never super into, I don't know, it was always just like big ripped dudes, which is fun, but it wasn't like relatable to me as like a young, like mixed woman in, Hawaii. I was like, okay, like I get the gist of it. And then we had like huge manga section, which makes sense because there's, a huge Japanese presence in Hawaii as well. And I was like, oh, okay. So we can have like young kids as protagonists, and, they're also doing like really dramatic and like ultra violent things, but they can also do like really, there's like tender slice of life storylines. There's like high action storylines. And I was just really impressed that manga could encompass so many flavors of story. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's what I was drawn to early on.
I have to admit, that's one of the reasons why I love that you did A Map to the Sun, because one of the things I've always said on this podcast, and people, I don't know if people are like saying it because it's just like a thing that I always say, or if they just think it's hilarious that I always bring it up, but I always wish there was more sports comics like there is in manga. I just don't get it. It just seems weird that, I don't know. Sometimes in comics, it seems like, especially in Western comics, like there's a box that comics thinks that it has to be in. And
right.
I love that, at least with the map, actually with everything you do, you kind of just say, fuck the box, and you're going to make your own one.
Yeah. No, I totally agree about sports comics. I think it's incredibly untapped, especially in the US where we have like, people are into basketball, people are into football. Like these are our national pastimes, and yet we have like one or two comics that are about that. And I feel like it's just such an easy, sports comics basically have a baked in plot. Like you have a character usually that joins a team, or they're going to like, step into this process of building up their skills, building up their body, building up, relationships with teammates. Like it's just these baked in elements that are already really like, moving and engaging. So yeah, I don't know why they're not a thing here.
Yeah, it's like you're saying, there's so much interpersonal dynamics to it. There's all the action. Honestly, like the path to greatness, that's not altogether that different to like superhero comics in some ways. It's like your origin story is starting to play basketball, and then when you become great, all of a sudden it's, I don't know, that's when you become the real superhero. I don't know. That and food comics, those are the two ones where I always wish we had more of. I just want, totally. I think that's just because I love food and sports though.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I'm interested in is like a good example of what I'm about to reference is in the lettering in Prism Stalker, like when you're sharing like Vep's thoughts, like the narration. One of the things I really love about it is it almost feels like a diary at times. Like you don't really necessarily always follow the typical, I don't know, what's the word I'm looking for? Like rules, I guess, of comics of like, this is where lettering goes. It goes within these boxes and everything like that. It feels very much like stream of consciousness at times in a way that interacts with the environment in a really cool way. And I guess one thing I'm interested in is whether or not you think that maybe coming into comics a little bit later, maybe coming into comics without solely looking at Western comics as an influence. Do you feel like that makes you a little bit less beholden to comic rules than, you might have been if you'd been like reading superhero comics since you were a little kid or something?
Yeah, totally. I think also a big thing is I never went to art school or anything or had any sort of like, mainstream art training. So everything I learned, I just learned by reading and drawing and practicing myself. So I never really felt any pressure to adhere to these rules. Like I could see patterns in the stuff I was reading, but I didn't feel like, oh, I have to do it this way. I was like, okay, that's like, one way to do it. I'll put that like in my toolbox and I'll use it if I think that's useful to the story.
Right.
Yeah.
At what point did you realize that, you were making comics when you were younger, whether you even knew they were comics or not at the time, but at what point did you realize you wanted to tell your own stories?
I mean, pretty young. I've always been, like I told you, I've always been a very like a person who's just been like in my head for a lot of my life.
Sure.
And telling myself stories. Yeah, when I was little, my parents told me to like, take notes at school so that, I could learn stuff, just so that I was like, could be like a studious, student or whatever. And so I didn't realize that they wanted me specifically to take notes about what the teacher was saying. And so I was like, okay, so if the teacher is talking about like math or geometry, I would try and write a story around the concept we were learning.
That is incredible.
Like a fictional story. And I would bring it home and I'm like, oh, look at my notes. And they're like, what is this? They're like, no, you take notes to like, so you remember concepts that you learned that day. I'm like, oh, okay. And so, yeah, it's always writing stories has always just been really fun for me. Yeah.
That's amazing. So stories were in your own way, kind of not only a thing you like to do, but also kind of how you learned.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a good way to put it.
That's amazing. Well, when did it become not just like something you like to do, but like when did it become something you wanted to do as a career? Because I know you don't just make comics, but you also write prose stories and everything. It seems like that is, I don't know. I mean, it seems like you've long kind of had a feeling that this is what I want to do with my life, if you will.
I mean, it's just something I always enjoyed and something I couldn't picture my life without. Sure. And when I was like 15, 16, I joined a website called EnterVOID, which is, it was a website where cartoonists would join. You would create like a character and a character sheet, and then you would pit your character against other people's characters within a comic that you would draw. So you would like duke it out via comic with another cartoonist. And then your comics would be voted on and critiqued. And yeah, there was a lot of cartoonists on there back in the day that now have like, really big careers like James Stokoe and Marley Zarcone and a bunch of other people. Evan Dom was on there for a little bit, which is really funny. But yeah, and I realized I was like, oh, okay, like, and they were working as well. These cartoonists, they weren't like fully fledged professionals. Mm-hmm. They were getting jobs, and I was like, oh, okay, that's like an option. But yeah, career-wise, I was always like, okay, even if I can't do this full time, like I'm just gonna be doing this because I enjoy it. So it's always felt just like a very foundational part of my life, and I don't know, I didn't really question it. I was just like, okay, this is just what I'm gonna do.
Yeah,
and that's that.
I'm not gonna lie, I'm terribly envious of you because growing up, I wanted to write, but I didn't really know how to apply it. And I remember being in college and just like melting down once when I called my mom and I was like, I don't know what I'm gonna do with my life. And I've always been very envious of the people who have this like clarity of vision as to what they want to do, even if you don't know precisely how it's gonna manifest. It just seemed like you knew your calling, and that's awesome.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely something that is hard to, well, not hard, but when other people are like, wow, like, how did you know? I'm like, how do you not know what you like to do? But yeah, that's definitely it's a very privileged and spoiled, fortune I had to know that early.
I have to say that EnterVOID experience, I read about that actually in another interview you did, and That seems incredibly stressful for somebody of your age at that time. Actually, it seems incredibly stressful, period. I bet if I did that with my art right now, I would probably like weep every time somebody did a critique for me. But it also feels like that kind of has to be a pretty formative experience because, you know, you're learning as you're doing these things. And you're hearing from people, I mean, like Stoko and Marley and all those other folks. Those are people who have really fantastic views of art. And I imagine you learned a lot in that experience.
Oh yeah, totally. It was incredibly formative. Like, you know, there was deadlines depending on how long the comic was. Usually the minimum was like a week for like a 3 or 4 pager. And it's like the stories themselves, like some of them were just basic, like, oh, okay, your character fights my character. But as you would draw more, you obviously get bored with that. So you would build stories surrounding your characters. And yeah, it was so much fun. And yeah, the critiques were really funny because a lot of people, you know, were not professionals. They're just like hobbyists. And part of the critique was kind of like grading on like 3 different kind of what am I trying to say? Like 3 different things that they would grade on was like originality, like style, and then like maybe like polish or something. I can't remember, but yeah, it was just funny because people were pretty brutally honest. So yeah, they could get pretty cruel, but I always thought it was pretty fun.
Yeah, I imagine having a community around it kind of ensured that people are like honest without being terribly mean, but maybe I'm being like overly aspirational about how people would be on the internet. I don't know.
Yeah. And this was like the early, I don't know, 2006, I want to say.
Sure.
And people were nice, but people were like, "Oh my God, this is hideous. You rushed this. You like drew this today, didn't you? Like you didn't even pace out your pages." And they would call you out on anything. And I'm like, "Oh, that's true." Or, you know, it was fun though. I was like thrilled to like get any attention basically, or any sort of feedback, because again, I was just like pretty isolated. I had no artist friends. So I was like, oh my God, this is great.
Well, it's kind of like, in a way, that was like your art school. At least part of it. I mean, you're just learning on the job. I mean, that's one of the things that people always tell me that make comics. It's like, there's only one way to learn how to make comics, and it's to make comics. And that seems really, I don't know, redundant or maybe duplicative. But at the same time, it's true. It's like you can't figure out how you want to tell comics, or you can't figure out how to make comics until you actually get into it. And yeah, I mean, learning on the job.
Yeah, exactly. You just have to fail through it and figure out what works for you and get out of that like theoretical headspace. As, you know, as fun as it is to like stay in that space, it's just like it's not going to help.
I find the idea of failing through it to be far too relatable.
Yeah.
Far too relatable. But okay, well, so I read in another interview that you're writing a novel currently, or at least you were last year from what I understand. And you also started both Prism Stalker and Graveneye as novels. I'm really interested in that because in my brain, it's like they're almost like binary things. It's like novel or comic. Like, which one is it going to be? But how do you decide what stories belong as comics and what stories should be prose? Like, are there rules of a sort that help you determine that, or is it a lot less formal than that?
It's flexible, but I do have some things that I think about. So with Prism Stalker, it started out as like a short story, and then it became interactive fiction. And then the scope of that grew too big for something interactive because I then found a plot that I wanted to follow through. Mm-hmm. So then it became like, you know, the beginnings of a novel. And then I was like, I think what changed it into a comic for me was I really got into the idea of drawing out, you know, there's psychic martial arts in Prism Stalker, and that changes the style of the art when a character is like undergoing like a psychic attack. Mm-hmm. And I was like, oh, that would be cool, you know, to do visually. And I don't think it would be as effective as just prose. So that the tipping point is usually like, okay, what can visuals do that prose can't, and like vice versa, and then kind of weigh them against each other.
That makes sense. I mean, it's like I don't know what the origins of A Map to the Sun are, but you know, that book is so, I don't want to say dependent, but like color is such an essential element to it.
Yeah.
That it's really hard to imagine that book without the visuals to it. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, that was a comic from the get-go. I just wanted to kind of bask in color, and I I don't know. I just had a very specific image in my head for the story, and it had always been a comic in its original and final form. Yeah.
I have to say, this is like a weird thing to say is like a favorite part of the book, but I'm like holding it in my hand right now. And one thing I always found to be really fascinating is when you just look at the pages from like the side when the book's closed.
Yeah.
The colors on it is like insane. Like I'm so used to just seeing like white or black or whatever. And I mean, it seems like every 10 pages, like the paper color is even different, which is absolutely wild.
Yes, totally. I know. I love that when I finally got a print version and I got to see. I didn't think the gutter colors would come through, but they did. And I was like, wow.
It's awesome. But actually, it was funny because I had several questions from listeners when I put it out on Patreon saying that you're coming on the podcast. Everyone asked about the color choices in A Map to the Sun. And James Kaplan asked, basically just wondering what inspired such a unique color palette and choices with that book.
I mean, I think growing up in Hawaii is a big thing. Like we're just surrounded, it's like the Rainbow State.
Yeah.
And growing up, our sunsets are just like insane, like these violent, vibrant colors. Like every day I would see like these incredible palettes. They're never the same as the day before.
Mm-hmm.
Think of like hibiscus, of like Ilima, all our flowers, and just how we would incorporate that into like, say, like, traditional Hawaiian wear. We have these bright orange and yellow capes. That was something our royalty wore. It was just like a natural, I think, part of how I developed my sense of color. And it felt natural to apply that to this story as well.
It's really interesting, coming from Alaska, and I'm sure you're feeling this in Portland to a certain degree too, but it's like my wife and I, we had our honeymoon in the Maldives and like the Indian Ocean. And it was crazy because there's two things I learned during that time. For my entire life, I thought I did not like fruit. And it turns out the reason why I didn't like fruit is because Alaska has terrible fruit and and the Maldives has really good fruit. And the other thing is, Alaska has a lot of dreary days. And because of the way that weather wears on kind of everything, there's just kind of a set way that things look in terms of colors and everything like that. But it was interesting going to somewhere that was island based and seeing such a vibrancy to the colors and everything like that, not just in nature, but in just everything. And you see that in Hawaii too. I could really see how that would be such an influence for you because of that.
Yeah, totally. And just like on a more like meta level, I just have always it's the same with Prism Stalker. Like I just feel like color is not fully utilized in comics a lot in the way that I do it. Like I really enjoy applying like non-literal color. I think it's kind of an underused tool in like our comic scene. So that was just something I wanted to do, which was actually really hard in A Map to the Sun because I was like, oh, okay, I'll color this like, kind of realistically. And then my publisher was like, no, we want like your crazy Prism Stalker colors and, not literal colors. And I was like, oh, okay, that should be easy. But then like 80 pages in, I had already used like, I don't know, like 15 different color palettes. And I had like 300 more pages to go. And I was like, oh crap, I need to I can't just keep using the same palettes. So then it just became like an experiment of me, like, color dropping color combos and seeing what worked. And like, one scene I really like that I wouldn't never usually use these colors, but it was like a dream sequence and it's like cream and like a kind of like deep ruddy maroon combo. And I was like, will this work? And I was like, oh, this actually looks cool, but I would never usually choose those colors. So yeah, a lot of it was just a lot of color play.
Yeah. And now a quick word from one of Off-Panel sponsors. Macroverse is a next-generation digital comics platform, and one with an astonishing number of comics, with currently over 50 series from over 100 creators on their app, with a 5-star rating both on Apple and Google's app stores. Download the app today and binge all their titles, including the Eisner-nominated Remind from Jason Brubaker and Lisa K. Weber that's been described as Harry Potter meets Blade Runner, or the new queer supernatural adventure series Husk that launches on November 1st. It's just $4.99 a month to subscribe to Macroverse, with proceeds directly supporting the creators on the platform. Keep an eye on the future of Macroverse too, as 2022 is going to bring an epic upgrade that offers a new level of digital collectability and more, with early adopters able to sign up for more information at macroverse.com. And now, back to the show. I was going to bring up that it does seem like color is a particularly important part of the creative process for you, but I do love that somehow led to Graveneye being black and white and red. I mean, obviously, like, Anna's a huge part of that, but Anna Bull's the artist on the book. But it's interesting to go from Prism Stalker and A Map to the Sun with these, like, very vibrant palettes to something that's so, deliberately limited for the storytelling. But at the same time, I mean, color is important to you, but you're not going to make decisions that don't make sense for the book. It'd be wild to read that with, like, Prism Stalker colors, for example.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, when we were discussing it, I just enjoyed Anna's inking so much, and I was trying to imagine it with color, and I really couldn't. And then when she did our sample pages and used the spot color, I was like, I think that's all we should do. Like, I think pushing it any further, and, like, trying to apply, like, maybe digital colors under, like, her washes and stuff, I just didn't think it would improve the art at all. I thought it was great how it was. And it's a horror comic, so I was like, oh yeah, like, this is really fitting. So
yeah, I mean, obviously this book that I'm gonna reference is not black and white, but at the same time, I feel like the reds that Anna uses really has the same impact as, like, what Emily Carroll did with, like, Through the Woods, where it's just like this red that's just, like, so searing, and it just, I don't know. The moments when you guys would use red in Graveneye is just, I don't know, it hits so hard. I mean, I guess it gets down to what you're talking about, is, like, using color as storytelling in a very specific way, and when it's not just used for, like, a pop, but for, like, having a real impact in the storytelling.
Yeah, totally. Again, like, non-literal color, applying it, like, to emotional moments, or, like, just objects that I want to bring forward in the image itself. Like, I find that much more engaging and interesting than just, like, coloring, like, okay, just the blood is going to get red.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get into Graveneye. It's your new comic with artist Anna Bowles through TKO. I'm going to do the solicit really quick. It's what if a haunted house was not the horror, but the people who dwell within it? Isla's house has seen its share of blood horror and the depths of the human soul. Cursed with sentience, it is destined to observe the terrors that lurk inside each and every one of us. To add to it a little bit, it's the story of these two characters, Isla and Marie, from the perspective of the house that they both, one lives in and then the other one cleans, and, like, the story of their relationship and everything. And it's fantastic. Honestly, I made the mistake of reading it before bed, and there was two problems with that. One, I found myself, like, so engrossed with it that I had to basically just keep reading and reading, despite the fact that it was bad for my bedtime, which makes me sound like a child, but at the same time, I have a schedule. And then the other thing is it's pretty intense. It is definitely a horror book, and it really nails the vibes throughout. But I wanted to get into the origins of this, because it's there's, like, a million different things I can ask about it, but I'm just curious as to where this idea came from. I know it started as a prose story. How did it develop from there into what we ended up with here?
So yeah, it had been sitting on the back burner as a prose story. I can't remember if I don't think I submitted it to many magazines. It was too, I think I might have, and I got feedback that it was just too dark for a lot of venues. So I was like, okay, I'll just hang on to this. And then I caught up with Anna a couple years ago, and I was like, we had both been also on EnterVOID, loved her work back then. And I was like, oh, what kind of comics are you doing? And I don't think she had been doing that many. And we got to talking, and I was like, oh, I have, like, a story that I think maybe could be cool for you to draw. And I sent it to her, and she immediately, like, just jumped in and was, like, doing concept art of, like, the characters and the house. And I was like, oh my God. I was like, okay, let me kind of, like, break this down. We'll do some, like, sample pages of, like, a scene. And yeah, it just basically took off from there. She just, like, knew exactly what she wanted to do with it, and I was, like, there for it.
When was this? Like, when did Anna first start digging into it?
Oh, I want to say, dang, maybe the end of 2018 or maybe the beginning of 2019.
Mm-hmm.
I don't actually remember exactly, but yeah, it feels like no time at all that this has come like to fruition. I think also that's just an effect of me being the writer.
Yeah.
And her having to do the art, this incredible, like hyper detailed art. I'm just like, oh my God, like how?
I also think it's just like the last few years, like time has stopped having like the usual. There's like I don't know what's the word for it. God, it starts with a D, but whatever. It's just like time just stopped having meaning. But at the same time, I always think it's really interesting how, it's like for us as readers, like we get this book and we're like, wow, like I never heard about this book before, and now all of a sudden it's out. This is like an amazing thing that came together so quickly. And then I find out it was 2018. I mean, you probably were submitting it to magazines well before then too. So like it was like a 4 or 5 year process, which is pretty wild.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Yeah, Anna just has such a great, I don't know, sense of character. And like we're working on another proposal right now. We finished it and it's being pitched. But I feel like she just has a magic touch with how to design characters and kind of manifesting the correct vibe for a story. Like, I don't know, she's just really good at doing that.
I'm really the two characters in the book. You kind of I don't want to say everything you need to know about them just from the first way that Anna depicts them, but the second you see Marie walk in the door, you just kind of understand her in a way, just in the way that Anna depicts her, and that's honestly a pretty rare trait in an artist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
I did want to ask, was there anything in specific that kind of helped this story form in your head? Just like, I mean, obviously, I was going to say spoilers, but we're going to talk about this. But, not just the fact that the narrator is the house itself, like the haunted house is the one that's actually the one that's telling the story, but also like this relationship. Was there, I don't know, influences in books or stories or comics or anything that helped you form this story in your head?
Not directly. Like, I wasn't thinking like, oh, I want to make a story like this.
Sure.
When I first started writing it, like the prose story is just the house's narration.
Mm-hmm.
So there's not a lot of description outside of it's speaking to the reader. And my inspiration for that was I kind of wanted to introduce this like almost like an alien element to like your classic, just like classic like murder mystery haunted house trope,
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the tropes just themselves were an inspiration. Yeah, and then as I developed it with Anna, and we realized I realized I had to convey a lot more. I had to convey like a deeper sense of who these characters were through like their acting and how they moved through the house.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to develop that more in the script stage, and kind of convey to her like what is actually the dynamic here between Marie and Isla, where it was just kind of vaguely hinted at before, just in the prose story.
Yeah, I think there's like a double page spread where Anna shows kind of a cutout of the house.
Yeah.
And it shows like where Anna and Isla Marie and Isla are moving through the house. And that does such a good job of showing these kind of parallel lives. And I think that's, one of the things that's so powerful about having the house as like this omniscient narrator is it kind of puts a distance. It doesn't like kind of favor one over the other like you would
Mm-hmm.
get if one of them was the narrator, because it's, I don't know, what's the old thing where people would say that like everyone's the hero of their own story. Instead, it's like the house having kind of, I mean, obviously the house kind of favors Isla because they've known Isla their entire life, but at the same time, it really, I don't know, kind of equalizes things for the characters and makes the story, I think, a lot more powerful than it would have been otherwise.
Oh, I'm glad you think that. Yeah, that was definitely one of my motives for like keeping just the house as the narrator and not introducing like, thought bubbles or word bubbles between Isla and Marie at all. The house is a very like an alien, like non-judgmental observer of things.
Mm-hmm.
And there was like, pros and cons like that might have made it too distant from these characters, but I also think it added like, I don't know, just something a little newer rather than kind of delving into the heads of like, Isla the murderer or Marie the victim and, kind of like reveling in their like obsessions.
Right.
I enjoyed kind of limiting my, the perspective we get to the house for that reason.
I did think it was interesting. I read this quote from you where you said that the most important part of storytelling for you is like an emotional basis to connect to. And I think it's interesting because, and I'm not saying this story isn't emotional because I think it is, but at the same time, it's fascinating to read the narration because in a lot of ways, the emotion is taken away from it because of the choice of narrator.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
I don't know. I mean, it seems like that type of choice, I'm trying to think of the right way to phrase this. It creates parameters where you kind of almost have to approach your own story in a much different way than you normally would, because like you're saying, like you couldn't, you might have gotten yourself into tough spots where you really wished you'd given yourself the space to write dialogue or thought bubbles, but instead you have to push your way around that. And I imagine that was probably a fascinating challenge for you as a writer.
Yeah, totally. So like one of my themes with Marie and Isla, and like I don't know if this comes through to every reader, but like, Maria is obsessed with Isla because she kind of like is both impressed by just her like self-possession, like Isla hunts.
Mm-hmm.
That's how she gets her food. She owns this house. She's like, strong, like single woman. It's a very like kind of like typical, she's kind of like a trope to Marie, but it's something Marie really like admires because Marie herself is like quiet, mousy. She's in like a horrible, like abusive marriage with this guy. And so she has this like fantasy around Isla, and also is like just, like in love with her on multiple levels.
Right.
And Isla, her whole thing is she just can't connect emotionally to anybody. And the only time she ever feels anything is when she's killing.
Right.
And when she's like, making her, taxidermy human animal art, she feels like she's fulfilling some sort of like bond between her and her victims. And so I wanted to kind of mirror that with the house who's narrating, who also is never going to get a clear picture or insight into who these characters are. All three of the characters have these like perspectives that are basically just like tunnel vision, kaleidoscopic, like, deformations of who these people actually are. And they'll never actually know each other or the truth of the other person.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I was trying to get at there. But yeah, it was definitely a challenge to convey that just by, visuals alone and not being like, outright telling the reader that.
Yeah. I think you do a great job with it because it's interesting because it's almost like all three characters find the part of them that's missing in these other characters.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's,
yeah.
I mean, like even the house, it's like, I think the house kind of like loves watching them because like that's how it almost personifies itself. It's through that relationship. Like this is a funny thing to say is like one of my favorite parts of it, but like the very first lines of the book, I think really nails it is the opening narration is the first time we met, I bit her, which was perfect because it makes the house feel like a person. But then on top of that, it sets up their relationship, Isla and Marie's relationship in a very real way. And I don't know, I really loved the way that you managed to kind of depict those like holes in these people's lives because I don't know, it's really fascinating. But I do want to ask, I have to bring up the taxidermy. I actually learned that there's in prep for this that there is a type of taxidermy called rogue taxidermy, which is apparently basically what Isla does, which is kind of like marrying these different types together to a certain degree.
Oh, okay. Cool.
What made that an angle you wanted for that character? Because it's such a fascinating angle, and it seems to me that like for you, this is like you said, like this is Isla trying to connect with these kills in a really real way. Is it really just that?
Yeah. Also, I'm just like Googling this on my phone, and this is like so cool.
It's really
awesome.
Apparently it's like a broad school of thought that covers a lot of things, but sometimes it's like when you, I don't know if you ever seen like jackalopes, like when they would put like the horns on rabbits, like that I think is kind of like rogue taxidermy. But anyways.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. Yeah, there's some really terrifying combos here. A lot of it is like I see a lot of like animals combined with like trash and like vintage, like I don't know, clocks and stuff. Anyway, that's pretty fun. I really like that. Let's see. So, I mean, besides just, I thought it would be aesthetically cool to have these like kind of like manifestations of her violence in these forms of like, you know, Frankenstein animals. But I also wanted to like, you know, kind of hint at a lot of, I feel like a lot of killers in popular culture, you know, they really like think that their violence and their murders are almost like an art form.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like also a way to kind of like disassociate from the actual feeling of killing somebody by making it into an art form and like giving it like a almost like an elevated sense of purpose and value. So that's what I felt like I was trying to do with Isla as well.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that came across at all.
Oh, totally.
But yeah, and it's also just something that she, you know, she can do by herself. Like no one, you know, she doesn't, she's not like a performative killer. Like she's not like a Hannibal type where she's like leaving kills around in like tableaus. Like this is just for her. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was also a good way to show like her interiority. You know, she has her private like art studio cellar where she makes all these works and, yeah, I just thought there's a lot of little elements that could add to her, so we could get a sense of her as a person without, you know, having her have to speak. So, yeah.
I think there's this one page in the book that I feel like depicts a lot of what we're talking about here, like the interiority of Isla, and then on top of that, like the color choices and everything. It's like a 9-panel grid-ish. Like 2 of the panels are not really part of the grid, where like Isla is looking down on Marie from above, with like the center panel being like the only one with this like burst of red. And it's really interesting because like the center panel is kind of like where her monstrous side comes out. And I don't know. I mean, like that's one of the things I really appreciate about the way that you wrote this is it seems to me, and maybe this is at least in part because you're an artist and you recognize the value of silence and letting the art do the talking, but it seemed like a lot of times you were really trying to give Anna space to do her job and tell the story visually as much as possible.
Oh yeah, totally. Like basically my script was just breaking down like what the page should include. So like that page that you're talking about, I had told her I just want one page of Isla watching Marie, and she starts pantomiming emotions. And this is something that she's done since she was little, because she doesn't feel anything, but she realizes to like engage with people, you need to be able to telegraph emotions.
Mm-hmm.
And that's basically what I said. I didn't break down any layouts for this. This is all Anna, because I knew she could handle that. And I actually prefer when, even as an artist myself, I prefer to handle layouts instead of having the writer script like page 1, panel 1, like I just think the artist has a better sense of how to pace and lay things out over myself. And I that's also just like a bonus part of collaboration. Like I got her vision for how these things would manifest visually. Mm-hmm. And that was like, that's rewarding for me, even if it wasn't like, even if it didn't match my vision, like to get Anna's, just like how she saw the page, like that's amazing to me. So yeah.
And now a quick word from one of off-panel sponsors. You may have heard of Bad Idea, the experimental comic book publisher that's rolling deep with titles from electric talents like Matt Kint, Mark Russell, Marguerite Sauvage, and more, and doing it with oversized, ad-free, over-the-top releases you can only find at select comic shops around the world. There's no variants, trades, or digital versions either, so if you want one of their big Final 5 releases that are being released throughout the rest of 2021, make sure to visit badideacorp.com to find a comic shop near you, or to pre-order a copy online. Do so soon, because rumors are saying Bad Idea is over, so this might be your last shot. And now, back to the show. Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because you start with like the story from your lens, and then Anna interprets your vision into her vision, which is really fascinating. I mean, it puts two layers of I don't know, like how this story should look into it. And I don't know, Anna does a remarkable job. But I have to ask, I was trying to figure it out, but have you written anything for another artist before? Or is this the first time?
Nothing long form. I've done like little mini comics where I wrote like 1-page stories, and then some artists drew like 4 to 5 pages of the story. But this is my only like long form work where I'm the writer.
How much does that change your scripting versus like when you're, writing like Prism Stalker or A Map to the Sun or something?
So like A Map to the Sun was not scripted. I wrote and drew that like as I went. So I would draw 1 page. Like I just pretty much freestyled it.
That is awesome.
Prism Stalker. Prism Stalker, there's like a plot line that I'm trying to build up to. So that is outlined, but also not scripted. And that's another way where I just like, I'm drawing and writing at the same time.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing.
So this is the first time where I had a more kind of meticulous breakdown of each issue. It's also like, we started this as issues with TKO, and they're like, actually, let's just do a graphic novel and we'll have it as a book. So then I was like, oh, okay. Which I was like not crazy about, but it's fine.
It does actually kind of work this way, because that was a question I had, was with the 4 different, I think it's 4 chapters, isn't it? Or is it 5?
5, yeah.
Yeah. When I was reading it, it's interesting how a lot of times when I think of horror, I think of actually novels. And in some ways, it works really well for it because it makes everything feel like a chapter. But it's interesting to find that it's kind of like retrofitted afterwards into like graphic novel form after you'd already written it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it was always going to be collected. I just kind of wish I knew that it was not going to ever be issues, because then I would have kind of
paced it differently.
Paced it a little bit differently, stretched things out. But I think it turned out good. Like, it's fine. But yeah, when I broke it down chapter by chapter, and then I gave like kind of like prose summaries for every page, and then added in, where I thought the narration should go, expanded on the narration, and then so a lot more detailed process wise for Anna. But usually I don't work that in that much of an organized manner.
This is kind of random, but this is not to say that you like this book less or something like that. But I think one thing that's interesting about comics is when I talk to artists, quite often they don't like looking back at their own work, where it's like they look back at it and all they can see is their mistakes.
Mm.
And I think it's interesting that, you as a person who mostly writes and draws your own stuff, do you feel like when you look at Graveneye, because now you can just be like, oh, wow, Anna's a boss, that like that kind of changes your relationship with the story in a way that maybe it's more difficult to look back on some of the work that you wrote and drew? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I actually don't hate my past work. Like,
good. That's healthy.
Yeah. To me, it's just like it's like a crystallization of my skill and who I was at the time. And even if there's stuff that I'm like, oh, that's pretty badly drawn, like, I'm still like, wow, I can't believe I drew a comic. Like, I have really nothing but good feels for my past work. It's my current work that I struggle with. But yeah, Graveneye, I can't see myself ever souring on this. Like, I feel like I'm at a point where I have like a really good grasp of like my taste level and like my sense of like technique. And when I look at the art for Graveneye, it's just like, I'm just like wowed every time I reread it.
I think one of the most underrated parts about it is the fact that Anna hand-lettered it too, right?
Yeah, she did.
That's unbelievable.
And she did the title. Isn't that crazy?
That is crazy. But I mean, like that title is like insane. Oh my God. I love it.
It's so good.
But I mean, like the hand lettering to it. I mean, that's one of the things that I think, I'm not saying that like this isn't a choice, because obviously you've had good collaborators, but like you had Aditya Bidikar did A Map to the Sun, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You've been, I mean, very blessed when it comes to the letterers, because
oh yeah,
like Graveneye, I mean, I can't even imagine what it would feel like if it was like just a font, if that makes sense. Because it's handwritten, it feels so much more personal, and that's really important to the story.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I've been, like you said, very blessed with my letters. They all have like just incredible taste and incredible sense of just how to match the style of the lettering to the art. And yeah, I am having these 3 letterers has made me incredibly picky with them now. And like, I personally, like, my lettering is like so bad. So I'm like, no, I just can't. Like, I've been trying to teach myself to letter better, and I'm just like, no. Impossible. It's impossible.
Here's the thing. I mean, I think it's important to recognize your limitations. Like, I recognized a long time ago that I am better at writing about comics than I am at actually making comics. And so that's what I do. I can't draw. I wanted to draw. I'm very, very bad at it. No one wants to see that. But anyways, I don't know. I mean, I think that's a good thing. I mean, honestly, I think it's a good thing that you can look back on your art. I always kind of felt like that was kind of a bummer that artists have such a hard time looking back on their work, because I don't know. I mean, I have to imagine there's stuff you can learn from your previous self. It's like there's probably good things in there, like maybe an energy that you lost as you moved along in your career or something like that. Maybe there are things you can pick up on if you can just look back on it and not just notice the mistakes. I don't know.
Yeah, totally. Like there's stuff that I drew in my teens that I think is some of the like best, most unique work I've ever done, and I can't get back to it. And it's just however my my muscle memory and how my brain has like formed new like gray matter pathways, like I just can't reach that style anymore.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it also has to do probably that I never went to school for art, and I feel like a lot of the neurosis that like my art friends that did go to school they have like a very, not negative, but they put a lot of pressure on themselves.
Yeah.
And I think that's just like, they spent so much money and so much time to develop their art that they're very like, they just have a very intense set of expectations for themselves and their work.
Yeah.
Whereas for me, I do have expectations for my work, but I don't know. This has always been fun for me. It's always been a positive thing. It's not something that I've staked my livelihood on. Like, I just do whatever I need to do to survive. And sometimes that's just doing like, random freelance work or editing work or janitorial work, really, whatever. So I have and I'm also like, I don't have like, I feel like a lot of my art friends also have like a critique group in their head, about, or like a professor that gave them like really cruel feedback one time. And that stuff really, it makes an impact, and it can hang over, your creative mindset for a long time. And that's hard to escape.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's totally true. I mean, it's hard to get like the voice of a prominent teacher in your life out of your head for a lot of people who went to art school. I remember talking to this veteran artist, and they like said that when they finished this one like page, they admitted to themselves, like in their head, they were just basically like, oh man, like so-and-so, my teacher from, 30 years ago would not have liked that I did this. And I'm like, wow, it really is hard to lose that sometimes, I think, for some people. I did an interview with this one artist, Mike Del Mundo, and he told me basically like he's kind of always trying to like live up to the kid in himself to a certain degree, where he wants to have that same energy and love for the work that he did when he was a kid, because it's like, otherwise, why is he doing it? I mean, he wants to improve his skills, but he still wants that energy behind it.
Yeah, totally.
Well, okay, so to close, I just had a few questions that were kind of broader. I wanted to ask about A Map to the Sun is a sports comic, but also kind of a slice of life comic. Graveneye, horror, Prism Stalkers, sci-fi. It seems like, I don't know, maybe not necessarily in a deliberate sense, but it seems like you like to explore different genres. Is that just because of your personal interest in different types of stories, or is it more about just finding the stories wherever they are in your head?
Yeah, I think it's both. I'm not like, what's the word? I'm not like faithful to any specific genre. I like the speculative genre broadly, because I like playing in a less limited narrative world. But like anything could inspire me. Like right now I'm working on a novel that's like how do I describe it? Post-apocalyptic surreal fantasy set in like 1890s Hawaii.
That is amazing.
But Hawaii has been displaced into like a separate universe, basically. And so it's like this deformed, like horror fantasy version of Hawaiian culture during that time. So yeah, I'm just always looking for anything that's interesting. And I'm not married to any particular genre. Just whatever is fun, whatever grabs my interest.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine most people who make things aren't going into something being like, you know what, today feels like a romantic comedy day.
Yeah.
But I mean, and the other thing too is Prism Stalker is a great example of this. It might be a science fiction story with like Sailor Moon roots, but at the same time, it also is a very personal story. And that's one of the things I think is underrated about genre is like quite often genre is just like, I don't want to say a mask. It's a different way to approach something that's already inside of you.
Mm-hmm. It's also good at like, especially with science fiction and like the recent, not super recent, but like there's a lot of like BIPOC like authors that are able to explore things that have to do with like their culture, but they kind of like extrapolate it on like a broader scale and like you're saying, kind of mask it through different types of worlds or characters or like alien species. And they're able to explore in more depth, kind of like the things that they struggle with. So like, in Prism Stalker, there's a lot about like colonization and assimilation and, feeling like a traitor despite not having control of like how of like who's controlling your life and your land. And that's a lot easier to explore in a fictional setting and also easier for a reader to digest.
Yeah.
Especially if they're like not part of that culture or if they're a part of like a colonizing culture. And yeah, I just think it's a very rich tool to use.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing is like you're saying about readers and stuff. It's like some people might not read a story like Prism Stalker if it was completely literal. But the fact that you position it as like this science fiction story, it helps you get your message across in a way that's like, I don't want to say more broadly acceptable, but in a way that like people won't realize what they're ingesting until like they've done it. And then they're like, oh, I get this now. And
yeah, totally.
I think that's really powerful.
Yeah. And also there's a sense of like guilt, I feel like that comes with it. And this could be, any sort of colonizing culture. I feel like it's difficult. You have like, like, I don't want to read this because it's just, it makes me feel guilty about like my heritage or my past. But when you can kind of counter that by introducing it through like, a mere world.
Right.
And yeah, you can kind of circumvent that.
Yeah. God only knows we're having a lot of that right now. Jeez.
Yeah.
Well, actually, really quick. So Prism Stalker is coming back next year, right?
Yes.
Awesome. I'm very excited
for it. It was supposed to come out this year, but yeah, I got held up because of, a little thing called a pandemic, but yeah. I'm hoping to finish inks next month and then hit colors and then I'm hoping for a summer release if I'm disciplined and get through it.
I'm still amazed that you did Prism Stalker Volume 1 and A Map to the Sun at the same time. That's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
Well, the last thing I want to bring up is, one thing I really like about the things you do in a broader sense is you've done interviews and reviews over at the Comics Journal. You've co-hosted the podcast Salt and Honey with Leslie Hung. I think that's really interesting because it strikes me as an outsider, and like this is amateur psychology hour, so I apologize about that. But it just seems like you're really interested in the way that things work, like particularly in comics. Is that kind of where those types of things come from you? Is like you wanted to talk to other creators about how they do everything, in like ways that they approach this stuff because you're interested in it, or is it these efforts come from like a different part of you? Like where does that stuff come from in you?
Yeah, I mean, I just love comics as a medium, but like in a broader sense, I just love storytelling. I love thinking about story and tradition and how culture and language changes how we receive and tell stories. And I feel like with comics, you get a lot of stories that are a little bit less reliant on traditional narratives, especially like mini comics or indie comics or graphic novels. Superhero stuff, not so much.
Right.
But to me, that it's just like a really fascinating like microcosm of really specific narrative traditions. And I just really like exploring that when I can like interview artists or just like talk with Leslie about how a story does what it does.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, like on a personal and theoretical level, like it's always been fun for me to dig into.
Yeah. It was really cool. Like I know you did those like was it the Maison des Auteurs, like the and Angoulême? I probably mispronounced like all of those words, so I apologize. But
no, you're good.
But I mean, like that. I mean, that type of setup where you just have all these kind of cartoonists in one area, basically. That just seemed like, I don't know, like that type of experience would be really fascinating. Just sitting around and just seeing how all these different people approach the same idea and art form and everything like that. That would be really illuminating for you, I imagine, just having that experience.
Yeah, it's just such a pleasure to hear people, especially at the Maison, like seeing people's workstations, seeing their concept art, seeing how they organize story in their head, the subject matter that they were, researching or writing, and getting to talk about their work with them as it's in process was really cool to me.
Yeah, that is really cool. Well, I'm very excited for everyone to discover your work in Graveneye, but that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on and talk about Graveneye, about colors, about your amazing third grade, vocabulary projects. I appreciate you taking the time, Sloane.
Oh, thank you so much. This was such a nice conversation. So happy to be here.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with cartoonist Sloane Leong. You can find Leong on Twitter at @SloaneSloane and her latest graphic novel Graveneye with artist Anna Bowles at TKO Studios. Love Off Panel, want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel. And when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site, Sketched at sketch.com, for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content and its members-only forum. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by liking on Facebook at /Sketched, following on Twitter and Instagram at @SketchComic, or following me at @SliceFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Nicholas Palmieri, Capes and Tights Podcast, Klaus Van de Ven, Brian, Submit Industries, Raj Patel, Jack Mulqueen, Kyle, Carl Kerschel, Robert Masella, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Elliot Metz, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Scott Pawan, Michael Tunk, Canadian by Proxy, Johnny Cannon, Brady Rader, Carl Troy, Brandon DePillos, Patrick Brower, Declan Shelby, Dan Garino, Josh Williamson, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Ryan Klein Q, SB, Nick Bennett, Daniel Whitfield, Susanna Polo, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, AbductedTheComic.com, Andrew Carita, Matt Mahoney, Charlie Chu, Stefan Hall, Pensacola Pop Comics, Kim Eslin, Philip Myra, Christian Sheldon, Kenny Porter, Chris Pacello, Torrin Grunbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Carl Mizell, Danny Ollie, Paul Salates, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Alistair Ross, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwan, Vita Ayala, Tara Ferguson, Dave Slusher, WMQ Comics, Akil Kokachi, Sean Pinello, Ken Heidelman, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, David Kelly, Rob Wilson IV, Nick Polito, Brendan Fletcher, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogart, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonacos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's theme song just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.